We have initiated a program in a very limited time, and we have quite a lot of topics that we're going to tackle. First and foremost, I kindly ask you to apologize me since we could not abide by the gender principle of development. We have 4 distinguished panelists in this forum. I will give them the floor and I will introduce them very briefly. Mr. Payne, Mr. Yu, Mr. Nashur, and İlhan Tekeli are with us. This session on habitat is significant to us in the sense that Habitat 2 conference was held in Turkey, and it is the first UN summit organized by Turkey. And when we were organizing this event, we did not have any conference hall. That's why we set up this Congress Valley just to serve this purpose, and we have prepared such a great valley that met all our expectations. Even the Rio summit did not meet our expectations. However, this valley considered the civil organizations as shareholders. I don't want to take up much of your time. I'd like to start with the speeches right away. As you are aware of, we will be meeting in this hall tomorrow, and the second Habitat conference will be held in here, and we will have distinguished participants who will offer you a broad vision. I believe we have distinguished speakers in this hall, and I would definitely go wherever they are to listen to their speeches. We don't have enough time. We will try to summarize Habitat in a span of 15 minutes, so without any further ado, I'd like to introduce our first speaker. Mr. Verschure will be taking the floor. He's an amateur. He's a professor in KU Leuven, and for 5 decades he has had great works in various topics, and starting with Vancouver, Istanbul, and Kyoto, he has joined all the Habitat conferences, and he has joined all the urban forums and contributed to them as a senior speaker and expert. Haiti, Nepal, Kenya, Senegal, Vietnam, Tanzania are some of the countries that he has worked in. Now, without any further ado, I'd like to give him the floor. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator, and I would like to say a special word of welcome to my colleagues, old friends. We've been working together so many times that we can start calling each other friends. I just have to see that it works properly.
Teknik destekten bir arkadaş yardımcı olabilir mi acaba?
Could we get some technical support, please?
Next one. Okay, so very briefly, and it's unreadable, that's on purpose, because it's a long history, and in the red blocks you just see the key points, 76, 96, and 2016, but a lot of other things have developed before and after and in between. So it's long and also complex. Maybe they have to operate from there, switch to the next slide because this doesn't seem to work. Could you switch? The next slide. This one doesn't seem to work. Does it work? You can switch to the next slide already. No, that's too far, that's too far. Back, back, back, back. Okay. Just a personal note, because I'm speaking here as not UN Habitat official at all, but having worked with UN Habitat regularly, so it's both as an insider and an outsider being also critical. The first note I want to make is 76 doesn't just appear out of the blue. There's a long history before that. And let me just add two personal elements of history. Chief Seattle, and I quote Chief Seattle because he was quoted by Kofi Annan several times, is the earth does not belong to us, we belong to the earth. That's a wisdom that was repeated several times. Kofi Annan repeated it. But I was working also with Kenneth Boulding in the 60s, and he was one of the top economists who at that time said, we have to really rethink economy and start calculating ecological costs of everything we do, because our earth system is limited. So, next one. The system doesn't seem to work. Okay. So, there is a history before that, and I think that's important to mention that no, please go back one slide. I don't know, this doesn't seem to work, I'm very sorry. Doesn't seem to work. Is there a way to... Then, next one? Yeah. Just a few elements to say that human settlements, urbanization, is extremely complex, it's often chaotic, we'll never be able to solve it entirely. So any illusion that is created that it's a simple problem, that I think we have to realize, and even by 2036 or the year 100 or 200 years from now, we'll still be talking and discussing about the problems because they're too complex. Next one. And before that, of course, there were several elements, very important elements that made, already in the 60s, a small UN Center for Housing, Building and Planning was established in New York. I started working with them in '69. Charles Abraham in the middle 60s already worked, for example, on the housing problem. Very important to mention that. There were alarming sounds like Paul Ehrlich, saying we're too many people. And at that time we weren't so many as we are now. And people keep saying we're too many. And of course, 68 is very well known as a kind of a key point, or at least it was felt to be a key point at the moment. Whether it is or it is not, that's another point of discussion. But very important is also that we had the the limits to growth in the early 70s, the Club of Rome report, and the Stockholm conference. Many people forget that, but Stockholm 72, led by Maurice Strong, was the first Earth conference, environmental conference as it was called. These were things that preceded 76 and inspired also. So it was not just starting from scratch. Next one. Habitat 1. Habitat 1, you could characterize it by voicing the alarm. Other would call it discovering the problem of urbanization. And as you can see, there were some pioneers, quite market pioneers, people like, I'm just quoting a few, John Turner, Buckminster Fuller, quite opposite actually in ideas. I mean, John Turner and Buckminster Fuller did not express the same ideas at all, but they stimulated the debate. Charles Correa and particularly Barbara Ward. What is very important is that it was not only the official conference, but also the Habitat Forum already. And the Habitat Forum was really quite an interesting event because it was probably where most of the real new ideas came from, and then inspired also the decision makers. Next one. Barbara Ward, with her two books and a famous speech at that time, Only One Earth, the Home of Man, really drew attention to, we're a small world and we only have one, and we better take care of it. Next one. So, and that of course is a personal interpretation, is what was Habitat 1 in terms of outcome? Well, the commitments were very clear, and they already existed to a certain degree, and it said sustainable development is development that means, it said that in the 87 report, but Barbara Ward had really already mentioned several of these ideas. Urbanization has to be tackled. Exploding cities was a famous film that at that time was shown, where the alarm was sounded and say we better solve the rapid urbanization. And commitments were made, and they were made quite innovatively. We really have to, let me just give you one example. It was said, for example, that land is a common good, not a private good, and that any development of land should be to the benefit of population at large. Can you imagine at that time that formulation? That has been forgotten since then, but anyway, I think I repeat that because it was a very clear, one of the clear points. What actually happened is that right during and even before and after, other elements started to break down some of the commitments. Reaganism, Thatcherism, neoliberalism, that's of course my critical reflection on that, and we can have discussions. Next one. As an intermediate element, I wanted to show this because there were already quite some early initiatives taken, training mid-career professionals, and you see some of the people around the table who were instrumental also in this training program. And in fact, if you look very carefully, you can see one of the Turkish participants in the picture, a lady who is sitting here and who is professor at the university here, but she was a student at that time at our university. And of course, visiting people like John Turner, like Elijah Gavey, and some of the younger people. One of the trainees in the program, you can see him here, he is now one of the top people in UN Habitat. And some of you from Maruf must have met him in the last May meeting in Istanbul, I think, Mr. Raftitz. Yeah. As an outcome of the now we're coming to Habitat 2. You could, in one catchphrase, say it was the emerging human settlements governance. 76 was sounding the alarm, but 96 was already saying, well, we have made commitments, but let's now get to business and organize and govern and manage things much better. So, of course, in between we had other important ones, the Rio 92, the Cairo Population Women Conference, the Kyoto Protocol, all of that, and things that came out, the Habitat Agenda 21, which I think was an important document. So in that sense, I think 96 was quite important, particularly for this Habitat Agenda, which described really in detail and followed the Agenda 21 of Rio. A lot of that was very detailed, very well developed. But again, if you look at the results, and I think this is again the critical note, the result is that although the Agenda 21, Habitat Agenda were right, they emphasize, for example, the right to housing, the enabling strategies, sustainable development, the recognition of the value of informal, formal settlements, and the complementarity was emphasized. But not all governments really, they committed, or they said they commit themselves to the right to housing, but in reality, it didn't really happen. And for example, slum clearance evictions still continued. Public-private partnerships was advocated, but it really turned out very often to be public duties and private profit. Local authorities was very clearly mentioned and importantly established, and they were really taken seriously as partners in the dialogue. The enabling strategies, but that was again discussed, and the question was raised whether the public sector was not leaving the burden too much to the citizen by sort of relinquishing and saying, no, no, let the citizens do things. I cannot enumerate all of the different programs that before 96 and after 96 really developed many, many very interesting ones. A few ones are listed here, but there are quite a lot more. But what is important is that the World Urban Fora, which in fact had been starting in Vancouver, because there was already a Habitat Forum, but now were formally established as World Urban Fora. And the 10th one is in preparation, February 2020 in Abu Dhabi. And the last one, of course, was in Malaysia. And so they were, we don't have time to really go into it, but in my opinion, the World Habitat Fora were equally important in terms of larger debate, in terms of community organizations, in terms of local authorities meeting between each other. This was not at all just people from official government delegations. They were also there, but it was much, much broader and in that sense much more important. Of course, by then we had the Millennium Development Goals. I won't say much about it, I just want to say that it was established that also each country should check how far are they in the Millennium Development Goals. This is just an example of India. You could see the red and the green dots, and meaning the reds, we haven't done much, and the green is, okay, we're on the way. Let me take just one example, is in the Millennium Development Goals, there was a specific item about improving the lives of 100 million slum dwellers. Well, that's very nice and very important. And it was achieved. But look at what happened. While it was achieved, at the same time, the number of slum dwellers grew, so that 100 million solved meant that it really was only a small part. And in fact, there was a growing number of slum dwellers. While you were solving the problem, we're not solving it fast enough. And I think that is a very important conclusion. Of course, I don't have to repeat that. Everyone knows that. But that, I think, the reason why I show it is very simply because there was a big debate in Quito and after Quito is why do we need a new urban agenda? Because we have the Sustainable Development Goals already. Very important, the difference between the early scheme of sustainability was that sustainability was a very small part between people, planet, and profit. And you see the word profit has been replaced by prosperity, which is quite an added peace partnership. Planet, people, of course, still there. And sustainable development as a much stronger element. And so 2016, Quito was towards establishing a new urban agenda. You could call it renewing the commitments. One element that is very important is, given that cities are now operating on a radically different economic and social ecosystem than in the 20th century. So that was the need for that event. Preparation was quite exhaustive, as it was for the previous conferences. I show here just many different steps, group of experts meeting, etc., etc., different regional meetings, different drafts, 0 drafts. But what was very clear is that urbanization was now recognized something as internal endogenous, and that new models to effectively address challenge of climate change had to be developed. Urbanization as a tool for social integration and equity. And then a few final slides just to say the debate. The debate is, but wait a minute, we have the SDGs already, and SDG 11 says make cities inclusive, safe, resilient, and sustainable. So what are we doing? Are we repeating the work that has already been done? Or, because look at what was already there. Yet, the urban agenda was developed, and the least word could say, it also aimed at addressing the unfinished businesses of the Millennium Development Goals. Commitments were there, stronger local authorities, the right to housing was expanded to the right to the city, increasing the care for public places, respecting heritage, etc., strengthening resilience, more equity. But the reality is that many thought that, well, wait a minute, we have critical reflections. What are the commitments of the different partners? For example, the private sector, increasing neoliberalism, and then emerging populism and individualism. And there came again the debate between United Nations versus local authorities. Some people went as far as saying, we don't need United Nations, we need United Cities or United Human Settlements. That, of course, is something that touches upon a very fundamental element. So, I'm just finishing here and saying, if you look at the bottom here, towards Habitat 4, 2036. The question is, if you look at the two photographs, the one on the left side seems to be the old image of a thriving city. And I won't name any city because I want to be diplomatic for once, but these are not the cities, I think, of the future. These are not the cities that in 2036 we want to have. At least we want to have cities that not only from top down, but people from bottom up can say, we want to have a city that is our city, that we feel as our city, and is not just imposed on us as an infrastructure on top of it. Okay, thank you very much, but it's up to the next generation. 2036 will be the next generation to develop that, learning from the old previous generation. Thank you.
Ben Sayın Verschure,
We would like to thank to Mr. Verschure for addressing to not only the three habitat processes, but also all the relevant issues, and also for addressing the aspects of the cities in this regard. So I will leave the floor to our next speaker, Mr. Geoffrey Payne. Has an experience of 50 years and India, Egypt, Papua New Guinea, and some many other countries are of his countries of study, and UNDP and Habitat, UN Habitat-like institutions are the institutions he delivers consultancy services to, and for 30 years has been training, and his daughter Tanya is following the tracks of his father and traveling the world, taking photographs, and also is in journalism. So without further ado, I would like to now leave the floor to Mr. Geoffrey Payne.
Thank you very much for the opportunity to contribute to this session and to meet some very great friends that I've known for more years than I care to acknowledge. I would like to compliment Hans' presentation, who gave a very comprehensive summary of the issues that were presented and discussed, by giving perhaps, if you'll excuse me, a personal perspective on these issues. So if I could have the first slide. Oh, thank you. The situation in 1976 was in some respects very different, in other respects very similar to today. I was not at Vancouver, but I had just finished a research report on urban housing and planning in Ankara. Having come here first of all in 1974, I finished the report about 1977, but as Habitat 1 was taking place, I was actually working with John Turner in London, teaching on the courses of urban planning and housing. And of course, it was a great privilege to see one of the great figures of housing globally, some of the giants on whose shoulders most of my generation has been building, to see the principles that he was espousing. I was once asked what I thought was the greatest idea that I've ever seen, or the last great idea. And I think it comes down to what John Turner and his colleagues, William Mangin and others that Hannah's referred to, was saying, was that this was the way of looking at the world in a different way. My generation was trained that architects and planners had the information, the knowledge, and the experience to plan and manage cities and to provide people with adequate housing. We then realized, of course, that a large proportion of the world cannot conform to the standards and norms that professionals and governments expect of them. The result is large proportions of unplanned, unauthorized. In fact, it was planned, but according to very different criteria to the ones the planners and professionals were looking at. And what John did, which was a great service to the professions and to the understanding of these issues, was to show that the informal, the self-generated housing was in fact part of the solution, not the problem. In other words, he looked at the world through the other end of the telescope, and I think that was very important in Habitat 1. The other thing which I was very impressed by was that his view of looking at housing was that housing is a process, and it's what it does for people, not just what it is. And it's therefore vital that people have a say in the design, location, and use of their housing. And Habitat 1, he made the greatest contribution with his book, Housing by People, which I think was a good way of putting it. And I was impressed to see, looking through my notes of the Habitat 1 process, of course we all pick on the things that we find of particular interest. But for me, the interest on inequitable growth will lead to unacceptable living conditions unless radical action is taken. Now that was 40 years ago. Inequitable growth, and we're looking at a world today which is highly unequal and becoming more unequal. It also established the right of housing as a human right, which we're still trying to recognize and to implement. And Section D of the report noted that private ownership contributes to social injustice. Now, of course, individual ownership has been promoted globally by national governments, by international agencies, as the solution to the problem. And yet 40 years ago, it was already recognized, if it got too far, to lead to injustice. So those are my reflections on Habitat 1. And I think that was a major event because it focused international attention on both the scale of the challenge and the nature of the challenge. And it enabled all the building professions and planning professions, architects, engineers, surveyors, quantity surveyors, and so on, to see the issue in a more holistic way. At the time of Habitat 1, as I said, I was working on a project in Egypt. And in most consultancy projects at that time, it was normal for consultants to have their own office. And then you would have a meeting room at the end of the corridor to discuss the overall issues. When we did our project, there was not enough space to operate in that way. We all had our desks around the side of the room. And in the middle was a table, a big table, where we would sit for meetings. But on that table was a map of the city we were trying to plan. That meant psychologically, we were continually aware that we were contributing to something bigger than ourselves, something that was more important than our own individual expertise. And I think that holistic approach is something which I've always regarded as one of the elements of the success of that project and something that I've always recommended and tried to achieve ever since. So a holistic, multidisciplinary approach, rather than the silos in which the professions often work, I think was central. Moving on to Habitat 2, before Habitat 2, my research on all of these issues led me to publish a book, to jointly edit a book, which was called The Living City Towards a Sustainable Future. John Turner, Arif Hassan, and Herbert Girardet all contributed very important chapters to that book. I was rather flattered 2 months ago to receive a notice from the publishers saying they plan to reissue it. Now, obviously, it's nice to have a book reissued 29 years after you've published it. But the subtitle of the book was Towards a Sustainable Future. And that rather depressed me, because if you think that the book is still needed 29 years later, then obviously the lessons were not learned in the first place. So I think it's a rather sobering as well as a flattering experience that this book is still considered necessary or appropriate. For me, the most important element of Habitat 2, which I was able to attend in Istanbul and which was another major global experience, was that while there was not much on finance or land management, not as much as I was hoping, having made that my area of specialization, what was very important, I still remember many sessions in which Verschure, who had contributed to this book on the living city, was being always surrounded by journalists, because he was talking about the ecology footprint of urban areas, how urban areas expanding into agricultural areas, the tensions that that creates culturally and economically and environmentally, and how we do need to put land to efficient use socially, culturally, and economically, try and create compact cities and in order to sustain, protect the environment. Moving on to habitat, there were many people present. As I said, the book that I contributed to has now been reissued. So moving on to Habitat 3 in Quito. I was invited by UN Habitat, and I suppose this is where my work in the previous 20 years had enabled me to become better known in terms of looking at land issues. I'd published widely on land tenure issues. I was very angry with the way that the World Bank had been promoting individual ownership, and I questioned a lot of the assumptions and the claims that the bank was making, and which others had been making, promoting individual ownership as the solution to global problems, and saying that if the developing world followed the West, then individual ownership was the means of accessing credit, that credit would enable you to open a business and everyone could escape poverty and become middle-class income groups. The research I did on that demonstrated that this is a false claim. There is no empirical evidence that I have seen since to support that, although I remain open to any evidence to the contrary. Of course, I'm not saying that individual ownership is wrong. I own my own house. It would be hypocritical of me to say that people should not own that. But experience has taught me that that should not be for everybody. It's certainly not suitable for the young, the old, or the poor. So Habitat 3 really, I was invited to contribute, to moderate a special session on housing, in which I was asked to give some of these comments and to introduce some of the key speakers on that. I'll talk about that in just a minute. I was also invited by Han Verschure's organization at the Catholic University of Leuven to contribute to a session, give a keynote paper on a parallel session on community development, land tenure, and social innovation. And that enabled me to present some of the work that we've been doing on land tenure and property rights. I'm very pleased to say that that will be a contribution to a book which Catholic University Leuven and also the Network Association of European Researchers on Urbanization in the South will be published later this year. And then third, I was a member of a panel. It was very interesting, talking to a wide range of contributors, mayors, consultants, NGOs, and academics from different countries. We were all asked to speak for a few minutes. And that, for me, was another major opportunity. Because one of the concerns I have about all these sort of conferences and the World Urban Fora is that it can be a tendency for us to preach to the converted. I'm sure all of us here today are concerned about the issues of urbanization, of urban opportunities, inequality, and the environmental challenge. But I do think that one of the big opportunities, certainly in Habitat 3, was participating with people from very different backgrounds and different perspectives. Because the key issue for me is that we do not just talk among ourselves, but we reach out to the wider public and engage with the political debates in our own countries. So those are the three things. And in addition, my wife, who's left to go home this morning, but she was invited by UN Habitat to moderate another special session on housing at the center of sustainable development. And I attended an event organized by Catherine Golder-Pongratz, who had made a film going back to the archive material that John Turner had done the previous 20 years for Habitat 1. And she's made a film on Turner's work by going back to Peru, talking to some of the original households who have been involved in the settlements, and also talking to their children and the next generation. So it was a longitudinal assessment of what's happened and what lessons can be learned. So that was a very good opportunity to go back and complete the circle. Now, of course, Habitat 3 had various objectives: identify key structural and global issues, the challenges to housing, exchange perspective on placing housing at the center of the agenda, proposing ways forward to guarantee the right to adequate housing in the implementation of the new urban agenda. That was structured in 4 parts, outlining the challenges, panel discussions, and so on. I think on reflection, one of the disappointments of Habitat 3 is that it did not come up with operational conditions and requirements whereby governments agreed to implement the recommendations which have been made in the new urban agenda. There is a concern I have that it's saying all the right things, but not in a way which is binding upon anybody. Now, of course, one has to accept that if all the countries in the world are negotiating, you are inevitably going to achieve a compromise. That is, I think, an understandable limitation of any international UN Habitat conference. At the same time, I think there is a danger that if we accept this as the basis for action, we can guarantee that only those countries that are really committed to achieving the SDGs and the MDGs and all the other objectives of the new urban agenda, they will be the only ones that make a difference. Everyone else will carry on as normal. I've just come back from Bhutan. 2 days ago, I was in Bhutan. For me, what was the amazing experience was that Bhutan in the 1970s changed its definition of development. I was watching the news this morning, and they were talking about a crisis in China and America with trade disputes, how that will affect global economic growth. Everyone talks about GDP as the definition of progress. For me, I've just read a book called GDP, Gross Domestic Problem. And that is a very interesting book I recommend. Bhutan and Vanuatu is one of the most vulnerable environmental countries in the world, one of the poorest. But Vanuatu and Bhutan have defined their definition of development and progress as gross national happiness. New Zealand has changed recently to measuring progress by gross national well-being. For me, this is an exciting opportunity to question for the first time in human history what we mean by progress. Do we need more and more money, more and more stuff, or should we redefine what we mean by a good quality of life? And that, for me, is what the UN agendas and all the discussions that we have collectively should be about. One of the most passionate contributions at the session I moderated was by Leilani Fari, who was the Special Rapporteur on Housing. And she talked about the need for a passionate recognition of the right to housing. Now, of course, it's all very well to have a right, but if you can't achieve or implement that, it means nothing. It was interesting also the minister from France, of course, giving her government's perspective. And I think as a consultant, as an independent consultant, I'm very conscious that I'm very privileged to see the issues, but I do not have the responsibility of making the compromises necessary to achieve implementation on the ground. So it's very easy for people like me to make grand statements and observations. I fully accept that for people under pressure with ministers demanding attention, how they move forward. But I do think that all of these issues need to be considered in their broadest context. One of the things which I notice has not been addressed at Habitat 3, which has become the issue in the 3 years since, is the climate crisis. So it shows in a way that the things that were addressed in Habitat 1, 2, and 3 about inequality, the need for social justice, the need for human rights and housing, still remains on the top of the agenda, to which we now have to add the environmental crisis of climate heating, not climate warming, climate heating. And I was very, I think we're all aware that we've now got 16-year-old girls telling world leaders what needs to happen. My generation, our generation around the table here, I think is possibly the luckiest generation in the whole of human history. We are in danger of passing the world on to the younger generation, many of you here in this room, in a very bad state, in a way which you will have to address the indulgent way of life that we have lived and are living. Please accept my apologies from my generation for the world we're passing on to you. We, the four of us, I know, are doing what we can in the years and time that we have left to remedy and address the challenges, and I hope very much that we'll be able to pass the world on to you in a better state than it is at the moment. But thank you very much for this opportunity.
We would like to thank Mr. Payne for such a comprehensive presentation, a very touching presentation it was actually. So another name who was very important in habitats, Nicholas Yu. For long years he delivered consultancy services to UN Habitat, and at Habitat 2 conference in Istanbul he was one of the administrators involved in the process for Habitat and for sustainability. He has taken active part at many international networks. Mr. Yo is now the director of the Guangzhou Institute for Urban Innovation, and is at the same time about sustainability and urban innovation governance, delivering consultancy to many institutions, many NGOs. And now I would like to, without further ado, leave the floor to Mr. Nicholas Yu. The floor is yours.
Very much, and to everybody. I'm reminded that the four of us sitting at this table represent 300 years of professional experience, which is quite frightening when you think about it. But nonetheless, we are, as you can see, still struggling on trying to find better solutions and better ways forward. I will not go back to Habitat 1, 2, and 3 as my predecessors did, because I realized that being the third person to speak, that most of the issues would have been covered by Hans and by Geoffrey. I just want to say that having been involved in all three conferences, in Habitat 1 I was part of the NGO forum, Habitat 2 I was part of the team that organized Habitat 2, and Habitat 3 I was heading the collective voice of the civil society organizations, otherwise known as the Global Urban Partners campaign. What I think was important is that at each one of these conferences we planted seeds that influenced thinking for the ensuing 20 years. So I think Habitat 1, as was mentioned already previously, planted the seed for housing as a basic need and a right. Unfortunately, that battle still has to be won. Habitat 2, I think we planted the seed for the right to the city, and that was a very much debated issue at Quito in Habitat 3. But I think Habitat 3 did something else also, which my previous speakers did not mention, is that it planted the seeds for what I would call a systems approach to sustainable urbanization. And this is very important because until Habitat 3, basically we were still thinking sectorally, we were acting sectorally. We're looking at housing independent from water, from infrastructure, from energy, from transport, etc. And to a large extent, we are still doing that today. But the seed was planted that we need, if you wish, a phrase that was already used 40 years ago, a holistic, more holistic approach to begin to solve these problems. And one of the underlying themes that has occurred over and over again since Habitat 3 is innovation. And what I would like to do is, in the next few minutes, just go over a few concrete examples that in my work, my daily work, I have been able to come across on what I believe are truly innovative approaches to solving some of the old problems, the problems that we're still struggling with 40 years after Habitat 1. So without much further ado, I will go to some examples. Now, what do we mean by urban innovation? Urban innovation in the context of all the discussions that we've had around Habitat 3 and since Habitat 3 is basically a call for new ways of thinking, and that these new ways of thinking be translated into new policies, new technologies, new business models, about integrating culture and heritage into our way of thinking about sustainability, also about new forms of partnerships, new forms of engagement, and new forms of governance. One of my favorite examples that I've come across in my work recently is the city of Surabaya in Indonesia. And what fascinated me about the example of Surabaya in terms of new policies is that the city of Surabaya did not have a budget for environmental management. It had a budget for waste collection, it had a budget for street cleaning, but it did not have a specific budget for environmental management. And yet the mayor decided that what was happening to her city was no longer acceptable. Of course, Surabaya is growing, its GDP is growing quite rapidly, as the GDP of Indonesia is growing quite rapidly. Its population is growing as well quite rapidly, average about 4% per year. But the solid waste was growing at above 10% a year. So in a very brief period of 3 years, this mayor was able to reduce not only the per capita production of waste, but also the absolute amount of waste. For me, the first city in the world that has done this on a systematic basis. And she did this without a budget. She did this by launching a movement. And this movement started with the low-income neighborhoods, where everybody started collecting their waste, separating their waste, started forming micro-enterprises to process that waste into a resource. So basically what she was doing was implementing a circular economy. And what we discovered by looking at what she had done was that she was tackling at the same time 5 of the Sustainable Development Goals. Sustainable cities, of course, good health and well-being, because reducing the absolute amount of liquid and solid waste, of course, has a major impact on health and well-being. Clean water and sanitation, affordable and clean energy, because much of the organic waste was being transformed into biogas, and decent work and economic growth. Thousands of jobs were created through this initiative. But one of the key aspects of Surabaya, which I think epitomizes the spirit of Surabaya, is that today in Surabaya, if you take the bus And if you bring the equivalent of 3 1.5-liter plastic bottles, you don't pay for the bus. So basically, all the children, all the elderly people, all the people with limited income are collecting plastic bottles, and they come and they get a free bus ride. But the real impact of this is not that you are just collecting and recycling plastic. It's that imagine how many specialized vehicles do you need to collect plastic from different plastic bins around the city every day. Here, all the plastic bottles of Surabaya are being collected by the public transport system, and all the buses end up in the same depot. So you're solving two problems: a problem of plastic, and you're solving a problem of how to collect and transport that plastic. I'm going to the other side of the world, to a small municipality in Canada. Surabaya is a very big city, 6 million people. Repigny is a small city with a few hundred thousand inhabitants. It's part of Greater Montreal. They had a big problem with youth and youth integration in their society. And they were learning from other best practices on how to integrate youth into social and economic life. And one of the things that they really came across, which I thought was really innovative, is that they decided that to convert all their public libraries, which in most cities today are underutilized, into places where you can learn how to program, places where you can play games, and you can develop new applications. So basically, instead of creating new incubators where young people can get together and learn the tools that they allow them to integrate new technology, here we use an old infrastructure, the library, and converted the library into a creative space where young people after school can go there, do their gaming, but also learn how to program and learn how to develop new applications. This has helped the city solve also the issue of quality education, because it's looking at continuing education after school hours. A very important aspect is the gender equality that it's been able to achieve. Decent work and economic growth. A lot of the children coming to these libraries after school are developing lifetime skills that will help them find work, and of course, SDG 11. Now I'm coming to Turkey, and this story is one of my favorite, even though I know it's a very hot topic right now in Turkey, the integration of immigrants, especially Syrian immigrants. You have a city here called Mezzetli that, unlike many other cities in Western Europe that had to accept a lot of Syrian refugees and immigrants of a more qualified nature, most of the immigrants, Syrian immigrants or refugees that landed in Mezzetli, were from rural areas with very few skills that they could use immediately in the job market. Approximately 60,000 registered refugees and immigrants, which means that the real figure is most probably much bigger. So after 2 years of knocking their heads together, the mayor decided to do something which I found is truly innovative. He did something which doesn't exist very much in this region. He created women-only markets. And what has happened is that the local women, Turkish women, together with the women immigrants, have created these markets together, one in each neighborhood. And these markets are now providing not only jobs, but also linking one of the key issues that came up during Habitat 3 is how to ensure urban-rural linkages. Right? So there's a direct link between farmers and the markets. Of course, this is a major boost to gender equality. They have in these markets, they collect all the organic waste to produce biogas energy, which is making these markets not entirely, but partially self-sufficient in energy. Of course, decent work, and one of the biggest problems we're facing today, the whole issue of social integration of immigrants and refugees. This is my all-time favorite story that I've come across recently, and it has to deal with one of the key issues that I think worry almost every single mayor in an emerging economy today. And that is, what do we do with disenchanted youth? What do we do with children that drop out of school? What do we do with the disenfranchised? So this is the case of La Paz, Bolivia. Bolivia is part of the Andean group of countries which are still relatively poor, and contrary to the rest of Latin America, still in the process of witnessing rural to urban migration. Most of Latin America is already highly urbanized, where the growth of cities is due to people migrating from smaller cities to bigger cities. But this is not the case of La Paz, where every year we have tens of thousands of farmers who are migrating directly to the city. And of course, this has, for any of you who have perhaps been to La Paz, it created one of the worst situations globally in terms of traffic accidents. We had pedestrians that did not respect traffic rules, and we had drivers who did not respect traffic rules. As a result, there were the highest incidents in the world for road-related injuries and accidents. Again, they tried everything: police, reinforcing the police, putting in traffic wardens, increasing the fines, civic education. Nothing worked. So in the end, the mayor of La Paz decided to do something quite original, and he basically mobilized the gangs of La Paz, youth that had dropped out of school, youth that had formed gangs, who were on the verge of becoming part of organized crime, and he trained them in mime and clown techniques. So basically they learned how to become a clown or a mime. They are dressed up as zebras, as you can see, and what they do is that they make fun of the pedestrians and the drivers. They make you look very stupid, but in a very friendly way, in a non-threatening way. I went to see this project a year and a half ago, and it has transformed pedestrian behavior, it has transformed driver behavior, but most importantly, when I interviewed some of the youth that were involved in this, almost 7,000 youth were involved in this initiative over a period of 10 years. More than 75% either went back to school or found jobs. And when I asked the social workers, the welfare workers, the educators, how do you explain such a big success rate on social integration of youth at risk, they told me that a young person, the main reason why a young person drops out of school, drops out of society, is lack of self-esteem. And this Zebra project gave these youth power, real power. Power to tell adults, power to tell the general population how stupid they were, but again, in a friendly way. The last one I would like to mention is, again, going back to Indonesia, is a slum. And this is one of the few cases in my career, and I've worked now for 40 years on slum upgrading and all the various different strategies for slum improvement. And this one really struck me as being highly successful. What happened in this slum is that quite an enlightened leader, local leader, decided that given that it rains all the time in this part of Indonesia, that the best thing they could do was to capture this rain, harvest this rain, and produce fruits and vegetables. So just take a look at these pictures. This is Glintun before. all the streets flooded. This is Glintoon 3 years later. Every single street has been converted into an urban farm. And those of you who have been to Indonesia will most probably agree with me that one of the things that is hard to find in Indonesia is fresh vegetables. It's not part of their traditional diet. But of course, with growing awareness, there's tremendous demand, especially by the growing middle class, for fresh vegetables. And what they are using is aquaponics to grow all forms of vegetables that are now being sold in the supermarkets and the boutique vegetable stalls throughout East Java. The income of the people living in this slum has increased over 800%. In fact, they can no longer be considered poor. Right? They can be considered as a burgeoning middle class. That's the difference. And I think this is one of the key problems we always faced with slum improvement, slum upgrading, is that we wanted to tackle the physical aspect, the infrastructure aspect, the services aspect, the building construction aspect. The key to solving the entire problem is the income aspect. Give these people a source of income and the slum will no longer exist in its present form. So what are some of the concluding observations? I think by looking at these case studies, and the observations don't only come from these 4 case studies, they come from about 100 different case studies, is that what can really make a difference in sustainable urbanization is an age-old principle that we already mentioned way back in Habitat 1, and that is that we have to put people first. But one that got lost along the way, which I think is becoming more and more important, is that it's the public sector, it's government at all levels. It's municipal government, it's provincial government, regional government that needs to exercise leadership. That leadership cannot come from the private sector and it cannot come from the community sector alone. We need strong leadership at the public sector level. We need to push for high standards of quality. I think one mistake that I have learned in 40 years of working with habitat-related issues is that we always compromised on quality in the end. We're constantly lowering standards, constantly lowering our own professional exigencies. Finally, we have to engage in continuous learning. We need to share information like we've never shared before. And we need to engage people. Participation is old hat. Participation is not enough. We have to engage people. Engaging people meaning giving them the real levers, the real means, the real tools to participate in decision making. Not just consulting them, but giving them real power. And then finally, we need to recognize leadership at all levels. Thank you very much for your kind attention.
Sayın Nikolasio'ya vermiş
Mr. Nicolasio, thank you very much for all the messages you have spread and the best cases scenarios. Now, I'd like to give the floor to the last speaker of this session. I don't need to introduce İlhan Tekeli to you, and he doesn't like being introduced. He has penned more than 100 books, and he has spent more than 660 articles in different topics. But what I'd like to tell you is that in Habitat 2 process, İlhan has become the main backbone of the process. He has worked hand in hand with more than 100 civil society organizations, and he has helped us to tackle the term habitability or inhabitability. And back then, we did not have the term governance in our vocabulary, and he introduced this term to us. Thank you, Sadun.
uzun zamandır.
Thank you very much, Sadun. We have been friends for long years. I guess you have pulled a little strings for me when you have introduced me. So I have a presentation, a paper, but I won't follow that. I will be talking about the limits. Well, actually, the paper had a title about the limits of habitat, what it can do, what it can't. So, in order to really fill the gaps, we have to know all the processes related with Habitat 1, 2, 3, and how the policies have changed. And at the end, why haven't those policies put in implementation? So it was a paper about that actually, but my colleagues made great presentations about the history of habitat, about its development from its first to its third. That's why, in order not to repeat what they already have shared with us, I will try my best to make a new format of presentation. So Sadun also mentioned one thing. I will have a presentation, a speech, which will be sitting on three pillars. First, what is conducting or carrying out a habitat summit? What kind of products we have out of it, and why can't those products be put in use? So this is the first pillar of my presentation today. And secondly, if we are to consider why these products are not put in use or practiced or implemented, then we should question why, because we cannot explain them through the differences in between the statements published by the habitats. The question we have to ask is why the nation states plus UN combination system can't manage the world. So without questioning that failure or inability to manage, we cannot discuss the applicability of the habitat documents. And the third issue, so the second issue is why can't the world be managed? And thirdly, Sadun, as I said before, mentioned one thing, the second Habitat Summit. What could Turkey do? And what was the unique aspects of this process? To what extent Turkey had managed to contribute, and how much indeed Habitat contributed to Turkey? This is the third pillar I will try to analyze. So you can interrupt me anytime. I can leave out any one of those three because I know we have some time concerns. So what's a Habitat Summit? Well, it is conducted every 20 years. And 20 years, 2 decades, is a long-term planning period. So the current processes are to be controlled in long term. That's why they are repeated every 20 years. And once you have such a perspective, the decisions made are either strategic decisions or preferences or political preferences. When you say action plan, the texts, the documents are called action plans, but don't think that they are going to be implemented or put in practice concretely. These are, mostly policy-like things. So when you look at all three habitats, you will see that they are also publishing a declaration under the title of the city that it is held at. So Istanbul Declaration, the Declaration, and other cities. So such declarations are answering two questions. First, what kind of problems are there for settlement, and also what kind of problems there are for housing. So the second document, generally it is called Agenda 21 or something like that. It's basically an action plan, and it is about the policy level recommendations. But the habitat cannot be comprehended only through the intellectual products. Otherwise, there will be missing points because these meetings are carried out in a long period of time of 15-20 days. And these are like mega events, a buzzword generally used for such events. So the moment it goes to that city, it takes with it this NGOs, the intellectuals, the representatives of governments. So it creates a phenomenon there. The place it goes, I mean the habitats. That's why the housing issue and the settlement are becoming the subjects discussed within that specific country per se. It draws much attention, and all the respective parties start talking about it, and if you will, there is an atmosphere of a festival about those topics, subject matters, when the habitats are carried out in specific places. But if you read the texts produced, yes, Vancouver 1's document is very much different than Habitat 2's document, because in the other one we see the GNS economy, the welfare state phenomenon, the Washington Memorandum. So many changes had taken place from the first one to the second one. But in each and every document, we see the level of maturity at the time it was organized, and it is comprised of suggestions, recommendations representing their times. So the habitat meetings and the ways that the texts are or the documents are negotiated, we see an inevitable lack of coherence. So United Nations and nation states are combined, and we then have this governance system of the world. And once the problem is put forward, all the participants from all countries define the target zone of those problems as large as possible. So every representative of every state contributes highly to expand the scope of those problems. And when we then talk about what we should do to solve those problems, then all the nation states have to say yes at such a large platform, but we see everyone says no. So at the end, we have big targets, big goals, and texts explaining those, but also texts which lack the tools to implement those practices and also achieve those goals. So this was the first pillar of my presentation, what a Habitat Summit is issue. So let's come to the second issue. Pulo, the chair of the Habitat 3, I read one text by him. He says everyone is free, and whoever feels free can implement it, and those who are not interested would not. Then you see nobody is implementing. Because in the texts about climate, there are commitments, but in those texts, documents, they're not commitments, binding commitments. It's like a sort of textbook, if you will. So why is it like that then? This is another aspect of the question. Then we have to really seriously ask this question, and we need to ask that everywhere. But we are not talking about it anywhere, because the world now is going through crises, and this is the question why we go through all these crises. The world is not being governed now. So the system comprising the nation states and the United Nations is failing to govern the world. Do you want proof? So first, this system, the United Nations system after the Second World War was established. What was the reason? It was established to bring about peace to the world. Has it managed to bring that peace? No. It can't. It hasn't. Because the nation states are still waging local wars. For example, outside we have a photo exhibition, the refugees, the asylum seekers. What does that show to us? It shows that the United Nations plus the nation state system is unable to govern the world. The world economy is growing, but inequality is also growing. Why? Because multinational companies aren't being regulated or kept under regulation. When they are not regulated, then they grow, but also grow inequality with themselves because the world isn't being governed. The climate issue. We have talked about it at this meeting too, and we have known it for many years. Every passing day it becomes worse. But are we able to make decisions? Yes, there are United Nations documents. Are the documents wrong? No, but it has no sanctions or binding power. Then it means that the world isn't being governed. So we can, the list can go on. We can give many more examples. And at no platform, the world is governed, and we cannot discuss it in any platform. It's not allowed. It's forbidden to even discuss that the world isn't being governed. And cosmopolitan democracy and multi-level governance under it are the things discussed. Now, and if we can establish such a system, then what will happen? Then the nation states will not be able to continue waging war through proxy wars, and the multinational companies will be regulated. That's why the growth in the world will not be leading to inequality. And when it comes to climate issue, the things will go beyond individual actions, if you want it or not, and effective decisions will be made. And in that multi-level governance system, all the gaps of democracy will disappear. The democratic gaps pressurized top-down by the governance will disappear. Should I stop? Do I have 2 minutes left? Okay. Now I'll come to the third issue. Istanbul's habitat. So the fact that Istanbul organized a habitat summit was maybe brought about by a Rio conference for the first time. It was raised as an issue, and the late president of Turkey, Süleyman Demirel, participated to that meeting. And the attraction of Rio, that mega event, that activity was called to Turkey. He did it. made a call, and Turkey rolled up sleeves for that. But of course, what Turkey could do was very limited. It was a big challenge at the time. Of course, we did not have such meeting rooms, as many as meeting rooms back then, as compared to today. So we have taken over that responsibility. So for the first time, through the reports and commitments of a state, was prepared in a civilian way by the participation of more than 250 NGOs. I mean, not by government institutions. And I was the board consultant then, and of course, the Habitat Summit and how the negotiations were done. I learned those during that process myself. Because when the summit was being prepared in the kitchen, of course, the final document to be was being negotiated. It was being negotiated in New York and Geneva, and we were flying from here to there. And then I wrote a piece because I was trying to learn what the United Nations summits were. And I wrote a piece comparing different summits by the UN. And then I have figured out that once, when the UN organizes a summit, it does not try to directly solve that problem at that summit. They are transferring the memoranda of the previous summits to the next one. For example, sustainability emerged in Rio and it was transferred over here. So we are negotiating. For example, our meeting is about urbanization, but the city summit, but we did not have any principles about that. And I said we should have some principles for us to be talking about cities and urbanization. And they asked me to suggest something, and I suggested back then the concept livability. So in United Nations concepts, if you, of course, coin a term, you have to define it. You can define it theoretically, but of course, all the participants should be in terms with it. And how is that going to be achieved? And then we thought to ourselves thoroughly and said that we can find a way, and asked what the United Nations cannot discuss is human rights. So we said then livability is the translation of human rights in cities, we said. So this is how the text was written. It took this into its core. And it was an interesting experience for me, as it was for Turkey. Just think about it. We did not have meeting rooms, and everyone was hectic. Just 1 week prior to the organization, the construction of the rooms, meeting rooms, were complete. So there's a big success behind it. Yiğit Gülöksüz shouldered all the responsibility, all the load, and carried it. I would like to commemorate his memory, indeed, for his great work and achievements. Thanks to him, we have that experience. We would like to thank to Professor Tekeli. Of course, as always, we don't have some time left for Q&A because we now have to leave the room to the next panelists. It's my maybe fault, but I could not interrupt any of our speakers. It was not my place to do. But all of our speakers, all of our panelists will be open to your questions and comments and contributions. This is what they at least told me. So I would like to finish with a couple of last thanks. We would like to thank to the Marmara Municipalities Union for that great organization and everyone who contributed to the organization process of our forum. And it is not easy to bring so many different people together. I also would like to thank to the distinguished interpreters who ensure we speak the same language. And of course, I would like to thank to you all of our guests, for your participation, for your attendance and interest. And I also would like to, of course, ask for a warm round of applause for our distinguished speakers.